Hello and welcome to Tech Deal's GTX 1660 launch video, $230, deal or no deal. Today we're doing a launch coverage of this card and I will be comparing it to the other four cards you see on the table, the RX 580 and 590, the GTX 1660 Ti and the RTX 2060. I have over 100 benchmarks in this video to show you today. Multiple games tested, 5 cards tested, 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. We have dollar cost per frame per second charts. There's a lot to show you here. So if you look down at the length of this video and say, I don't have time to watch that, not to worry. I'm going to summarize this in the first 5 or 10 minutes as I usually do, and then we will get into the detail of all the benchmarks. And then I'll provide you with my summary and what I think about this craziness. In the summer of 2016, a once-in-a-generation event occurred when NVIDIA launched Pascal, the 10 series of graphics cards that really changed the dynamics of the graphics card business. These were dramatically faster than the 900 Maxwell series that came before it. But that is not normal, and it's not what you should expect from generation to generation. But it has thrown off a lot of people's expectations, and I've seen a lot of comments from this new line of cards saying, well, this isn't dramatically faster, what's the big deal? Of course it's not. You're not supposed to get double the performance generation over generation, at least not every time. It does occur occasionally. The last time it occurred with NVIDIA was back in 2008 with the launch of Tesla, the 8000 series of graphics cards, which were the first unified shader model of cards that replaced the fixed function hardware from the 7000 series and before. While it wasn't overnight, very quickly, games, programs, DirectX started to take advantage of the unified shader model, and we saw the 8000 series run away with the performance very, very quickly and leave everything else in the dust. The 8000 was so successful, it got rebranded into the 9000 and rebranded again into the 100 OEM series and even the 200 series, the GTX 200 series cards at retail, so it got used for 4 different generations. Tesla had long legs. Now after that we had Fermi, Kepler, Maxwell, Pascal, and now Turing. But the only one of those generations that had that great leap forward was Pascal. Pascal, in many cases, the 10 series, was double the performance of Maxwell, the 900 series. Forza Horizon 4, 1080p high detail GTX 960, 50 frames per second. GTX 1060 6GB card, 100 frames per second. It is literally double the performance. But that doubling of performance is rare, and it usually takes 3 generations of cards to get that level of performance. The GTX 1660, that's going to take a while to get used to saying. The 1660 is roughly the same launch price as the GTX 1060 6GB card for 25% more performance, so it's faster for the same money, 2.5 years later. Normally it'd be 1.5 years later and then it wouldn't be quite so painful, but the 10 series was monstrously successful. This is probably only going to last a year, year and a half before we have a 30 series and 40 series. We will get a die shrink at some point. We still haven't gotten a die shrink. These are still 12 nanometer GPUs, so 7 nanometer is definitely coming on them. If you have a 10 series, keep it. If you have a 900 series, holy smokes, 125 frames per second versus 50, that's an upgrade worth doing. The GTX 1660 non-Ti is, for all intents and purposes, really meant to replace the 3GB GTX 1060. The Ti version of the card replaces the 6GB 1060. Thankfully, this time they added the Ti onto it so we didn't confuse everybody in the process. Although it is worth noting, these both have 6GB of VRAM. One thing worth noting is it's not the same VRAM. The non-Ti card has GDDR5 and the Ti card has GDDR6. The GDDR6 is dramatically and noticeably faster. It is also worth noting these two cards do not have the same compute horsepower. The Ti card has more CUDA cores. So when it comes to performance, there is a performance improvement due to both the increased CUDA core count and due to the faster VRAM. If you can afford to move up to this, It's simply a faster card all the way around. But on average, it costs $50 to $60 more. Is it worth it? Well, that's what the dollar cost per frame per second charts are for later in the video. We'll get to that. But it is basically $50 to $60 less expensive than the Ti card, and it's about the same price as an RX 590. Spoiler alert, in most situations, the 1660 is faster than the RX 590. However, on launch day, the RX 590, at least in the United States and most Western countries, comes with 3 free games worth up to $150. And that is an impressive value equation if you care about such things. The game package is not as strong at launch, obviously, on a brand new card. But in terms of price, these are roughly equal in price, with the 1660 being a faster card. And of course, it is much faster than an RX 580. One nice benefit for live streamers is this does have the new Turing cores and the improved NVIDIA encoder. If you want to live stream to Twitch, for example, and use OBS and the NVIDIA GPU encoder, this has better image quality at the same performance and quality settings versus a 10 series card, and this does have enough performance on board to both play games at 1080p and live stream them on Twitch at the same time. You don't need a hardware capture card, you don't need a separate computer, because the NVIDIA hardware encoder is separate from the CUDA core, so it doesn't dramatically slow down your overall gaming performance. You might want to step up to a faster card if you're playing AAA games, but if you're playing esports games and you're streaming on Twitch, this is a very nice option due to the superior NVIDIA encoder. At the beginning of this video, I stated that the new GTX 1660 was launching for $230. That's true, but the model that I'm testing here is $20 more. It's $250. In my opinion, it's worth every penny. I would absolutely recommend you spend the extra money to buy the Gaming X variant versus one of the less expensive models. This is the MSI Ventus RTX 2060. I've previously covered this in my Which RTX 2060 video should you buy? And in that video, I basically said, don't buy it, not recommended. The reason is the cooler. It has a plastic backplate instead of a metal backplate. The fans are loud, it runs hot, and it was an altogether not very nice experience. Now that I've had a chance to test the new Gaming X model, my opinion is 180 degrees different. This is my new favorite cooler design on the lower end generation. It is quiet, it is cool, and these fans barely turn. This card out of the box reaches nearly 2 gigahertz clock speed. That is not overclocked, no sliders removed in MSI Afterburner, nothing. It does it all on its own. And it does it with the fans turning barely over 1,000 RPM. This thing is nearly silent. It is very difficult to hear from just a couple of feet away, and that's on an open air test bench. Everything negative that I said about MSI's Ventus cooler is positive about this one, and for $20 there is not one shred of doubt in my mind. It is worth every penny. It is faster, cooler, quieter, and it has pretty RGB on it. What more could you possibly want? Now there will of course be other models, and I will link to those down in the video description below, and if you buy a premium model in the $250 price range, you'll probably get a quality card overall. But I genuinely have to say, this is very nice. I do have to say it's a very sharp looking card as well. Feels very well built, very substantial in hand. These two fans are very quiet. There's RGB lighting on the front, the logo's on the top. All the red plastic of the previous card is gone. If you're familiar with the 10 series Gaming X from MSI, yeah, this is nothing like it. The backplate is brushed metal. It is very nice. We have 3 DisplayPort and 1 HDMI 2.0 port on the back. It's not too tall, it's not too long. It uses a single 8-pin PCI Express power connector. And just to show you these two cards side by side, holy smokes. Now, obviously appearances and design are very personal and very subjective, and maybe you like the red plastic that was on the old Gaming X. I think the newer one is much nicer looking. The heat pipe design is better, it's not sticking out the top, the logo looks nicer, the backplate looks nicer. I think MSI has done an excellent job with these cards. To be completely blunt, if I had reviewed the Gaming X when I did the RTX 2060 series instead of the Ventus, I probably would have given it a 2 thumbs up recommendation. This is a really nice cooler, and don't waste your money buying the cheap end cards. Get this for 20 bucks, it's a no-brainer. And with that being said, let's take a look at our first benchmark. The first game we're looking at is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. You are currently watching the 1080p benchmark results here. 4 cards, RX 580 and 590 on the top, and then the new GTX 1660 on the bottom left with the 1660 Ti on the bottom right. As you can see from the real-time performance numbers here, the new 1660 is faster than the RX 590 by a little bit. It depends upon what resolution in game and whatnot, for about the same money, making it a pretty interesting deal, at least until you consider those free games that come with it. The test bench today is a bit overpowered for all of these cards, but at least it removes the CPU from being a primary consideration. The i9-9900K at 5 GHz fixed clock speed with 16 GB of DDR4, 3200 MHz CL14 RAM, it's the good stuff. This basically means we're looking at graphics card differences rather than CPU bottlenecks, or at least as much as I can do. Now, all of these graphics cards are running at full speed, and you can see their fan speeds and temperatures on the screen. I do have to give MSI credit here. Take a look at the fan speed. The GTX 1660 here, the Gaming X, is a silent running card, very quiet. I've got loud cards, I've got quiet cards, and this is a very, very quiet card. Notice the clock speed on this card is nearly 2 GHz. I have not manually overclocked this. I have not moved the sliders. I didn't increase the power beyond 100%. I didn't touch anything. This is bone stock out of the box. And this Gaming X from MSI is running at 2 GHz. That is very nice. Notice the GTX 1660 Ti is running closer to 1900 MHz. That is an EVGA single fan card, which is why the fan speed is running so much higher. The temperature's not higher, but the fan speed's higher because there's only one fan on it, and that's closer to a base level card. It's about $20 less than the Gaming X 1660 Ti is. However, if you want a silent, fast running card, the Gaming X is really, really nice, and I like this iteration of the card with its design. In my personal opinion, it's just subjective, the new design lacking the old black and red plastic of the previous generations of Gaming X, the more gray and black look with the RGB lights, it looks really, really sharp. And that metal backplate means it runs cooler and it's not as hot to the touch, and it's just better overall, especially much better than the Ventus, which I tested when I did the RTX 2060. Didn't like the plastic back of the Ventus. I really like the metal back and the metal design of this Gaming X from MSI. We are now going to look at a bunch of benchmark charts, starting with the 1080p average, minimum, and maximum frame rates in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. We've got in red the RX 588 gig, and then in orange the RX 598 gig. Yellow is the card we're launching today, the GTX 1660. In green, we have the 1660 Ti, and in light blue, we have the RTX 2060 included to bookend it, so you know basically where the step up is above these level of cards, although at $350 and up, it is at another price class. Notice the smooth stair step of performance from 69 to 74, 80, 93, and then 112 frames per second on average. You very much get what you pay for, and in this next chart, I'm going to show you that with the dollar cost per frame per second on the average frame rate. We're going to include that chart throughout all of these benchmarks, but we'll go through it fairly quickly because I have a lot of charts to show you. This chart shows the dollar cost per frame per second of each of these 5 cards. The RX 580 is $2.74 per frame per second. The GTX 1660 is $2.86 per frame per second. This is less than a 5% cost difference between the cards on a per frame basis. Yes, the RX 580 is cheaper, but it's not as fast. So the question is, do you want an extra boost of performance? Do you want a slight bump with a little bit more future-proofing, not a ton, but a little bit more, in exchange for a very small price increase? Ironically, the RX 590 is the worse value here, but it does come with an extra game. On the day I'm recording this video, there's a promotion running right now. You get 3 games for free with the RX 590 and only 2 games for free with the RX 580. So that does affect it if you value that. Moving on to the 1440p chart, we see here that we get 53 frames per second average out of the new GTX 1660. This is definitely better than the 47 an RX 580 does, but nowhere near as good as the Ti card does at 63. There's a 10 frame per second difference here. Looking at the dollar cost per frame per second chart, these are all rounding error differences. We go from $4.02 at the low end to $4.69 for the RX 590. Interestingly enough, while the $4.65 cost of the RTX 2060 is definitely higher than the 2 GTX cards, not by enough to matter. You shouldn't pick these cards based upon this chart. These are all so close to each other. Buy the card that's at the price point you want, that has the features you want, that comes with the games that you want, and that has the performance that you want. If you want to play Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1440p, the RTX 2060 is a great choice. Finally, I am including the 4K results. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is not really playable at 4K on any of these cards. Some of the other games I'm testing are, but I'm putting these here as a bookend so you have an idea of where performance falls off and frankly what you can and cannot do with these cards at 4K. And simply because I'm thorough, here is the dollar cost per frame per second chart at 4K for the 5 cards. Next up, we have Strange Brigade. Same layout as before, the 2 RX cards on the top, the 2 GTX cards on the bottom. This game runs really, really well on modest hardware, not just at 1080p, but this will run great at 1440p on these cards as well. Not quite so much 4K unless maybe you turn the detail down to medium and customize the settings a bit, but 1440p would work really nice. Unless you have a high frame rate monitor, in which case, well, you just wait for the benchmark charts. But the real-time performance on the screen should frankly tell you everything that you need to know. Do take a look at the VRAM usage. We're just under 3 gigabytes of VRAM. We were between 4 to 4.5 gigabytes of VRAM in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Very few games really use more than 4 or 5 gigabytes of VRAM, and as I showed in my recent video, Shadow of the Tomb Raider actually plays pretty well even on a 3 gig card. So while some people are concerned about the 6 gigabytes versus 8 gigabytes of VRAM on these cards, I don't think it's an issue. The RX cards love this game. It's very well optimized for AMD, and as you take a look at the results here, the RX 580 actually beats the GTX 1660 by 1 frame per second, at least in averages. The minimum is higher on NVIDIA, but honestly, they're so close it's not going to be a big deal. Now, the RTX 2060, of course, runs away with it, but it has quite a bit more horsepower than either of the GTX cards do, and you can see where the benefit is if you have a 144Hz monitor and you want to play games like Strange Brigade with other players and you want a really, really responsive, fast-moving experience. But any of these cards would do a great job. Not surprisingly, the RX 580 crushes the dollar cost per frame per second chart here because, of course it does. At the same performance roughly and at a lower price, it's going to win that battle every time. Between 70 and 80 frames per second on all the RX and GTX cards, it's very playable at 1440p. In fact, if you want a higher frame rate, set it to medium detail and you'll be pushing 100. Dollar cost per frame per second, no surprises here. At 4K, the only card I would call playable is an RTX 2060, but let's be honest, 4K is very demanding and $350 for a video card is quite reasonable at 4K. But lower the detail settings a bit if, for whatever reason, 4K is important to you, by all means. Although if you're going to lower the detail, what's the point of the high resolution? It shows what the cards can do, but none of these are really 4K cards. Cost per frame per second at 4K? Next up is Assassin's Creed Odyssey. The Assassin's Creed series has been running for a lot of years now. Very popular series of games, very demanding series of games. Not, shall we say, the most optimized titles ever, but at 1080p high detail, we're only using just over 3 gigs of VRAM and the frame rates are playable. We're below 60 frames per second at the moment on the RX 580. We're above 60 frames per second on the GTX 1660. But then again, it does cost a bit more. But these are all definitely playable at 1080p high detail. It's worth noting that if you want to play games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, do keep in mind that if you buy any of these 4 cards here, and you want 60 frames per second, you're essentially already at that limit with these cards. If you want the card to last more than 18 months, you might want to buy a bit more card, and this is why in my RTX 2060 video I said it was the ultimate card, because if you want some future-proofing, well, these cards are already at 60, so give it another 18 months of game releases, and it won't be, but that's the nature of cards. This is about the most linear stair step you could ask for: 61, 66, 73, 82, and 91. Pay more, get more. Hey, it works. And then the same thing with the minimums, although the 2 RX cards do have a bit of a lower minimum. And then on the maximum, again, it's a fairly even stair step. How much performance do you want? Spend more and you'll get it. The new GTX 1660 has almost exactly the same dollar cost per frame per second as the venerable RX 580. The other cards cost a bit more. If you want a bit more performance, get the TI. It's not a huge jump, and as you can see, the RTX 2060 is, well, just a bit more. But all things considered, these are all pretty close to each other. 1440p results for you to enjoy. I don't really consider any of these 1440p cards for the latest AAA games, maybe the 2060 if you want to stretch it. Just keep in mind that if that's your goal, these cards don't have much life in front of them because the next generation of games will just push these numbers down further. Same chart, different data? I seriously considered not bothering testing these cards at 4K, but since I did, here's the results. None of them perform acceptably, none of these are useful, so just forget it for games like this. The only thing this chart should tell you is how much of a better deal 1080p gaming is to 4K. With this generation of cards, you get what you pay for. Spend a bit more, get a bit more. The stair step of performance as you go from $190 to $350 is fairly consistent, and the dollar cost per frame per second does not budge by that much. Ironically, the least expensive card in absolute terms in this pile of video cards here is the RX 580, and it does come with 2 free games at the moment. On the other hand, it's at the tail end of its life, and if you're buying a new video card for 1080p gaming, it doesn't have years and years of life in front of it, whereas perhaps an RTX 2060 does. I called it the ultimate 1080p gaming card in my previous review, and actually a bunch of people commented on that and said, "No, that's ridiculous. What are you talking about? It's a 1440p card." Well, yes it is today, but it has the same problem at 1440p that the RX 580 does at 1080p. No life in front of it. 18 months from now, it's going to be obsolete for that. You're going to be running under 60 frames per second at 1440p gaming, whereas it has easily 3+ years of life on it at 1080p. Now, having said that, that brings up the question, is a GTX 1660 a 3-year 1080p gaming card? No, not really. Maybe 2 years. It's in the middle. An RX 580 might be a year-ish, this might be 2-ish, and this might be 3-ish years. But it depends upon what games you play, and it depends upon how current you want to keep with games, whether you want to keep upgrading to the latest and greatest game, or maybe you're a casual gamer and you only play free-to-play games like League of Legends and World of Tanks, and maybe you play some World of Warcraft, in which case, frankly, an RTX 2060 is a bit overkill. A GTX 1660 will let you play those games, they'll let you live stream them, and they'll let you do it for years and years to come. Then again, frankly, so will an RX 580, so there's that. But the truth is, there's not a huge price difference between those cards, the RX 580, 590, 1660. It's only when you get to the TI and the 2060 does the price sort of start to get up there. Next, I'm going to show you some more benchmarks, but there's no gameplay footage because that would just make this video ridiculously long if I showed you footage from every single benchmark. So instead, I'm just going to show you the charts. We have a lot of charts to get through here, and we're going to go as quickly as possible, so if you want to see any of these that go by really fast, don't be afraid to pause the video. This is Far Cry 5 at 1080p, a very stable benchmark, very consistent from run to run, but the actual game itself isn't nearly this consistent. Always keep that in mind when looking at these charts, is that your performance of the game is going to vary greatly depending upon what you're doing at any given point in time. At 1080p, all of these cards do a really good job at high detail. Not necessarily ultra, mind you, but that's why I tested high detail, because that's actually where I recommend that you play. 79, then 86, 90, 106, that's a fairly decent jump there, and then 121 for the average frame rate. When it comes to the cost, it's really hard to beat the value of the RX 580. It is the quote deal, but if you want a bit more performance for a completely trivial additional amount of money per frame per second, then the two GTX cards are absolutely worth considering as alternatives for a small performance jump. 1440p, 61 frames per second on the new GTX 1660. However, for a small additional amount of money, you get 73 frames per second. There's that faster GDDR6 and some other benefits. So if you want to play at 1440p, I think stepping up to those cards makes sense, but these are remarkable results considering this is a fairly recent AAA game. 1440p is nice, 4K is not. These just for AAA games, these are not 4K gaming cards. If you're looking for 100 plus frames per second at 1080p high detail in For Honor, well, you're in luck. 119 frames per second average in the built-in benchmark in For Honor, but of course actual gameplay with the patches and updates and the variety of enhancements they've come out with since will drag this down somewhat. Of course, the RX 580 certainly does a fine job, but if you want 144 frames per second, spend a little bit more, move up the list, and you'll certainly get it. This is why I'm including all three resolutions. While Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, etc. are not going to run at high resolutions on all these $200 to $300 cards, a surprising number of games will, including supported games such as For Honor that's continuing to have content releases. 75 frames per second at 1440p on the $229 GTX 1660. That's not bad. Well, 4K is where it falls apart. Sure, if you turn the detail down to low, yes, you could get 4K out of it, but if you turn the detail down, why not run at 1440p high and have a much prettier image? 4K low is not necessarily an improvement, but that's a personal choice. Driving and racing games want high frame rates. Makes them more responsive, more exciting, more fluid, smoother, especially if you have a high refresh rate monitor. 125 frames per second average in Forza Horizon 4 is a very nice result indeed. That being said, all of these numbers are pretty close to each other because at some point the game just doesn't run any faster, especially when it's heavily using the CPU. To see a larger difference, you got to step up to 1440p or perhaps turn the detail up to ultra. We are in fact doing high detail here, but notice that we have a spread from 85 to 116. Now, all of these are very, very playable at 1440p, and this game is absolutely gorgeous at high detail, and those are great playable frame rates. 59 frames per second at 4K high detail. This isn't typical, but I would like to point out that the new $229 GTX 1660 will do 60 frames per second at 4K in Forza Horizon 4. Granted, the RX 580 will do 54 frames per second, so that's not too far apart. This is a great example of whether a card can do 1080p, 1440p, or 4K depends greatly on the game that you're playing. If you want to play Battlefield 4, for example, you can play that at 4K on many of these cards. Battlefield 5, not so much, so it just depends upon what you're playing. Those of you who watch my channel regularly know I love Ghost Recon Wildlands. I've benchmarked it, I've played it, I've live streamed it, I've beaten this game. It's a whole bunch of fun. 83 frames per second on the new 1660, which in the real world is going to translate somewhere in the 65 to 70 frames per second in real live gameplay. These are the built-in benchmarks here. The real game doesn't run quite this fast. I've shown that in previous videos. That RX 580 number looks great, but I can promise you in real live gameplay, 55 frames per second is about what an RX 580 is going to give you, so take 10 or 15 frames per second each off of these to get the, quote, real numbers. In fact, that's remarkably common when looking at benchmark charts versus real live gameplay, as rarely do games, especially after some patches, content updates, etc., and the busy areas, do they ever really hold up. But these are all very, very playable regardless. Lo and behold, 59 frames per second at 1440p. You can, don't. Maybe on the TI, really on the RTX 2060s where you're going to want to be at if you want to do 1440p in Ghost Recons because of the fall off. And of course the 51 isn't going to hold up as all. The RX 580, I could tell you from experience, will be down into the low 40s or upper 30s in real gameplay. 4K results for those of you who insist upon them. Well, there you have it, folks. A week of work, 100 benchmarks, 5 cards tested, and a lot of work to bring you this video. I hope it was helpful, useful, and informative to you. If you've decided to make a purchasing decision and this was helpful to you and you want to support the channel, please use those links down in the video description below. Links to all of these cards from NVIDIA and AMD will be down there to Amazon and Newegg. Using those links supports the channel at no extra cost to you, and it would be greatly appreciated and will let me bring you more content like this in the very near future. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below. Hit the bell notification icon next to that if you'd like to be notified when new videos are coming out. Hit the join button next to that if you'd like to financially support the channel, get exclusive tech deals emoji and a loyalty badge in chat. I would greatly appreciate it. Other links down in the description below, Patreon, PayPal, Floatplane, and my social media links, Twitter, Twitch, etc. is all down there. Thank you so much for watching. I will see all of you next time.